Thank you, Roger, for that introduction, and welcome to all of you. Great you found time to attend this talk. I had the good fortune to have been involved in the Coelacanth story from my childhood. It's really one of the great stories in the history of science, and most of it happened in South Africa or was undertaken by South Africans in other parts of the Indian Ocean. Now, Christmas tree. You'll see as the story unfolds that the reason why it's given this name is because the first one was caught within 2 days of Christmas in 1938. The second one was caught within 3 days of Christmas in 1952. And a whole lot of other events in the unfolding of the Coelacanth drama took place around Christmas. So that's why it's been nicknamed the Christmas fish. But it's also called the Lazarus fish and the Phoenix fish because it rose up as if from the dead and appeared living again. And it's even become a figure of speech in the English language. Winston Churchill once called a backbencher who had said nothing for 20 years and then got up to give a great speech, that Coelacanth of a man. So it's a fish, as I'll explain, that has a rich natural history and also what I call a cultural history. In other words, the way in which it's been inculcated into human culture. Now, the modern story of the Coelacanth starts in 1836 when this Swiss-American paleontologist, Louis Agassiz, found a new kind of fossil, fish fossil, in England. And he gave it the name Coelacanthus, which means hollow spine, because one of the diagnostic characters was the hollow spines in the tail thing. This is very unusual for a fish. But of course, the Coelacanth story starts long before that. 420 million years ago, that is how old the oldest Coelacanth fossil is about. And they're actually quite abundant in the fossil record. They've been found on all continents, including Africa and Antarctica. And that over 100 species of extinct coelacanth are known from the just to put this in perspective, 420 million years ago, there were no trees or flowering plants on land. There were no higher forms of life on land. The continents were joined at Pangaea. The coelacanth, therefore, its group has therefore survived an enormous span of time. It survived 5 major extinctions that killed off nearly 3/4 of all large animals. It's still alive today, and I personally predict that it will outlive humans. Coelacanth fossils continue to be found. This is a colleague, Robert Guess, from the Albany Museum in Macondo, and he found the fossils of the small estuarine coelacanth, which is called Serenichthys cowiensis, because it occurs in the Cowie River. And it's quite remarkable the quality of the fossils that he's discovered. So there's Pangaea, that's the supercontinent around which the original coelacanths lived. And you can see Africa and South America are joined. The Indian subcontinent is attached to East Africa, as is Antarctica, and the world was a very different place. Coelacanths predated the first dinosaurs by over 180 million years. So that puts their longevity in perspective. They lived with the dinosaurs, but when the dinosaurs were wiped out 65 million years ago, the coelacanths managed to survive. At least one coelacanth, one dinosaur species ate coelacanths. And this is an African dinosaur from North Africa called Spinosaurus or. And if you look carefully, you can see it's got a coelacanth in its mouth. And we know they ate coelacanths because fossil coelacanths have been found in the fossilized stomachs of Spinosaurus. So that great meteorite strike, which changed the climate forever and changed life on Earth forever, was responsible for the extinction of the dinosaurs. But there was a higher survival rate of animals in the oceans than on land for obvious reasons. Now, the first character in the Coelacanth drama is J.L.B. Smith, who as a child was known as Len Smith, There's a photograph of him 3 to 4 years old. He was born in the Graaff-Reinet district in the Karoo in 1897. I'm not quite sure why he's wearing a sailor suit in the Karoo, but it was the fashion at the time. And he, from the outset, was interested in nature, and apparently used to trace copper monkey lizards and investigate the plants and animals of the Karoo. When he was 7 years old, the family went on holiday to Nyasland. This is the very house in which they stayed. They travelled there from Port Elizabeth by Cape Cod, and that was where Jeremy Smith caught his first fish, which was a blacktail. And he was greatly elated by this, and in fact became totally hooked on angling, to the extent that when he went back to the family home in the Karoo, he used to practice his casting by fasting into the chicken knot with a caterpillar on the hook and try to catch some chickens. Anyway, the family eventually moved to the Western Cape, and J.L.B. Smith spent his last 3 years at Bishop's, where he was an outstanding scholar. And one of his hobbies, as quoted here by Barry Sutton, who was his science teacher, was that he found the remnants of a museum, a natural history museum that had been established at Bishop some years earlier in the attic of this building. And it fired his imagination and spurred him to inquiry. In fact, he resuscitated this natural history museum. After matriculating and spending a disastrous few months in East Africa at the beginning of the First World War, when he contracted every available tropical disease, he returned to Victoria College, now Stellenbosch University, and was one of South Africa's leading scholars in the field of science. As you can see, first in South Africa, first part. And as a result, he attracted many scholarships, which took him to Cambridge University. At this stage of his life, his main field of study was chemistry, and especially organic chemistry, and his PhD was actually on mustard gases that were used in the First World War. And it's interesting that the conclusions he reached in his PhD influenced the decision of the League of Nations to ban the use of mustard gases in future. After he completed his PhD, he returned to Rhodes University College, to South Africa at Rhodes, where he was appointed a senior lecturer in chemistry in 1923, and that's where he married his first wife, Henriette Pienaar. Now, Henriette came from a very famous South African family called the Rugby Pienaars. Her oldest brother, Theo, was in fact the captain of the first South African rugby team to travel to Australia and New Zealand. And 6 of her brothers were all first-class rugby players. So he was married to Henriette for 15 years. They had 3 kids. And the interesting thing is that his first marriage was suppressed in subsequent years. And I was a student of theology at Rhodes University for 18 years before I found out that he'd had a first marriage. And that came about when I did research for the biography that I've written on J.L.B. and his wife, called the Fishy Smiths. J.L.B., as I said, was an organic chemist, and one of the things he studied were the active ingredients in various indigenous plants, such as fufu. And the work that he and his students did really laid the foundation for many of the industries that had been established around indigenous plants. But he retained his interest in ichthyology. And in his diaries and early writings, there are many accounts of how he would travel by train from Grahamstown to Port Alfred, and then by Oxwagon up the coast to remote fishing spots. Because even in the 20s and 30s, Oxwagons were still in common use in South Africa in remote areas. Now, J.L.B. had a very analytical mind. He was an extremely intelligent angler. And he gained the reputation for being able to catch fish where nobody else caught anything, and even to be able to predict, basically given tide and weather and time of day, which fish he would catch, and he was almost always right. He found that the fishes that he was catching in the Eastern Cape, many of them he couldn't identify in the available literature, mainly written by a man called Keppel Barnard. So from 1930 onwards, he started to publish descriptions of the species that he caught that hadn't been described before. And even though he had no formal qualifications in ichthyology at all, by 1938 he published 17 papers and described 35 new species of fishes. He also tried his hand at illustrating fishes. In top right there was a terrible cartoon illustration that he did in his first fish sketch, and it was rejected by the editor of the journal. But he didn't give up. He was a very determined man, spent a few thousand hours training himself to be an artist, and in the end he was producing quality work like the one bottom left, the colour painting of a yellow-headed butterfly. The second hero in our Coelacanth drama is a lady called Marjorie Coelacanth. And we're very privileged actually to have in our audience Terry Peterson, who is let me get it right, the granddaughter of one of Marjorie's sisters, Lorna. Is that right?
That's right.
Isn't it fabulous to have a direct descendant, a relative of Marjorie in our audience? Welcome, Sarah. I have a completely different talk on Marjorie, so I can't spend too much time on her. Just to say that at the age of only 24 years, she was appointed as the first director of the East London Museum in 1931. She was quite a remarkable woman who came from a very poor background, and by the end of her career was recognized as one of the leading museum directors, not only in South Africa, but in the world. In 1936, she took some leave and went to Bird Island in Algoa Bay, where you could see the giant dinosaur colony on Bird Island. And while she was there, she made collections of marine specimens, and she met the skipper of an Irvin & Johnson fishing boat, Hendrik Coelacanth. Coelacanth had previously put rabbits on Bird Island, and then they would occasionally come back and harvest some rabbits for the crew to eat. And that's how they met, and Coelacanth transported crates of specimens Marjorie had collected back to East London, and they developed a very healthy working relationship. Then, on the 23rd of December 1938, 2 days before Christmas, Hendrik Coelacanth was finishing his commercial trawl off East London, and off the Chalumna River, he shot his trawl one more time, specifically to collect specimens for Marjorie's museum. And this is one of the greatest strokes of luck in scientific history, in my opinion, that trawl caught a coelacanth. Now, just to put it in perspective, that's the equivalent of finding a dinosaur walking down Main Street. Because the coelacanth fossil record ends with that of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. There was absolutely no evidence that they'd survived that event. So to catch one was quite remarkable. Coelacanth brought the fish back to East London Harbour, and it was taken onto the wooden wharf on the left there, which is now commemorated as Latimer's Landing, named after Marjorie Coelacanth. And there's Marjorie much later in life. This is one of the photos that Terry's kindly made available to me, standing at back of this landing in the Buffalo Dock. Now, Marjorie went down to the docks to see what Coelacanth had collected for her. She found a pile of sharks and rays and so on, and was about to leave when she saw interesting blue fins sticking out the pile. She asked the crew to clear the other fish away, and what was revealed was what she called the most beautiful fish she's ever seen. Now, she had a problem. How do I get it back to the museum? It weighed 56 kilograms, it was dripping with oil. The taxi driver who had brought her down there refused to take it into his taxi. But Marjorie was a very persuasive warrior. He did take it to his taxi. She took it back to the museum, and even though she had no training in ichthyology, her naturalist instinct made her realized that this is something very different. The crew on the trawler, who have been fishing the waters off the Eastern Cape for 3 decades, said they'd never seen anything like. And when she paged through the few books available to her, there was nothing on a fish shaped like this. Just a little bit of background on Marjorie. There she is arrowed with 6 of her 6 sisters and stepsisters. And as you can see, they're not exactly well groomed. Marjorie's father was a railway station master, and he and his wife and their daughters travelled widely around the interior of the Eastern Cape in the 20s and 30s. In fact, Marjorie lived in 25 different places in the first 20 years of her life, and sometimes they were so poor they actually gathered food by foraging in the veld. It's particularly during the Boer Rebellion, just before the First World War, and during the First World War, they were literally living off the veld. And as a result, she developed a fantastic knowledge of natural history. Later in her life, during her directorship, the chairman of her board, P.D. Smith, converted a caravan into a field laboratory, and they travelled the length and breadth of southern Africa collecting specimens for the museum. And there's Marjorie with V.D. Smith at Ganubi, and she became a very accomplished botanist, ornithologist, and museologist. And this is a flower named after her, Latimelia latimerii. Marjorie's fiorti, called fiorti because if you rub the petals, it makes a high-pitched sound like a little violin. And there, many years later, the 2 heroes of that early Coelacanth thatch, Hedda Fullerton and Marjorie, with the Find-A-Glass class at the East London Museum. And just one of the many accolades that Marjorie received was an honorary doctorate from Rhodes University in 1971. Now that's not bad for someone who had a very disjointed schooling. She never ever did the tricks because she had to go off and work in order to generate income for the family. But she not only was awarded an honorary doctorate, but she had a woman's residence at Rhodes University named after her. So let's get back to that fish that she took to the museum. Her first problem was how to preserve it. The whole of East London, every chemist in East London didn't have enough formalin to preserve the fish. So unfortunately, the internal organs, which of course is the only part that's not preserved in the fossil record, had to be discarded. And the fish was very crudely mounted in this way. Marjorie sent a letter with this famous sketch, which has now become an iconic sketch in the history of science, comparable, I think, to Darwin's famous cladogram, in which he wrote, "I think," at the top. But you can see in the sketch that Marjorie was an accomplished naturalist. She identified the main diagnostic characters of the coelacanth, the bony head, the large scales, the 2 pairs of paired fins, and especially the extra lobe on the tail fin, which she called the puppy dog tail. The coelacanths are the only fish in the world that have that extra lobe. He sent that off to J.L.B. Smith, who was then on holiday in Knysna. Smith took one look at this fish and nearly collapsed after drawing, because he knew the fossil record. He'd read about fossil fishes, and he immediately realized that this is a fish belonging to a group that is extinct. He had to be very cautious because he was an amateur ichthyologist. He also didn't want to damage the career of Marjorie by making some sensational discovery and then found to be wrong. So it took him a while to realize just how important this fish was. In fact, it was 44 days before he managed to get to East London to see the fish, and immediately he saw it. He told Marjorie that this is a coelacanth and it will make your museum world famous. He subsequently described the species, calling it Latimeria gelumni, and he placed it in the family Latimeraidae and the suborder Latimeroidea. So Marjorie's name is recognized in 3 different ways. And the publication of the description in the British journal Nature caused a sensation around the world. And to this day, the discovery of the coelacanth is regarded as one of the greatest biological discoveries of the 20th century because of the window into the past it provided. Here was a living fish of Devonian origin, which we could study not as a fossil, but as a specimen of a living animal. And in fact, a recent American science historian recently wrote that, in his opinion, there are three main factors which cause the public to understand the concept of evolution by natural selection. The first one was obviously Darwin's book on the origin of species. The second was the discovery of fossils of dinosaurs. And the third was the discovery of the living coelacanth. Now, because the internal anatomy had been thrown away, J.L.B. Smith, after describing that first specimen, was determined to find another specimen that was fully intact so he could also describe the internal organs. Unfortunately, the Second World War intervened. He couldn't do anything during that time. But immediately after the Second World War, from 1946 to the mid-50s, he mounted a series of expeditions with his second wife, Margaret Smith, up the East African coast. Because J.L.B. Smith, being an angler, had a very good knowledge of fish. And by examining the coelacanths, he determined that they are fishes that live at a moderate depth over rocky reefs, probably more in the tropics and in the subtemperate zone around East London, that they are predators of fish, and that they don't live particularly deep. And he was right on all accounts. So he mounted a series of expeditions all the way up the Mozambique coast to areas that still today are remote and dangerous to travel to. He also traveled to Kenya and Tanzania, but unfortunately didn't have the means to get to either the Comores or Madagascar. And here you can see him in a typical pith helmet holding a deadly stonefish. And there he and Margaret sorting the fishes. Now, you must realize that these areas were so remote that the African people there had never seen white people before. They were tormented by man-eating lions, giant snakes in the sea, moray eels and sharks were threatening, and of course, mosquitoes and other insects. During his PhD work at Cambridge, J.L.B. also studied explosives, so he had a good knowledge of how to create small hand grenade-sized explosives. And somewhat controversially, he used this as a method of collecting. He would explode the little grenade in mid-water, so it sent out a shock wave, which caused the fish to come to the surface. Not necessarily to die, but just to float out and then recover, and then he would collect what he needed. Unfortunately, a Durban journalist wrote a book called Sea Safari with Professor Smith, a chap called Peter Barnett, and it's a wonderfully descriptive book of hardships that they undertook during these expeditions, looking for a coelacanth, but also collecting other fish. There they are in Chamonix, their crude field laboratory. Margaret trained herself as an artist, and she's capturing the live colours of fish, because as you know, soon after they die, they lose the colour, and J.L.B. Smith is busy describing them. Interestingly, the map on the left here is the one that J.L.B. Smith drew on one of his expeditions in 1947, identifying sites where coelacanths may be found, but they didn't find any. And the map on the right is one that we recently published of exactly the same coast, and using satellite imagery and other modern technology, we've identified the exact same bit of coast as a prime habitat for coelacanths. Anyway, they collected tens of thousands of fish specimens, transported them back to Grahamstown, and Rhodes University provided this rather ramshackle premises for their historic research. And they continued to describe fishes. They published some world-class books. 1949 was the first one, The Sea Fishes of Southern Africa, 1,200 species. And as the fish fauna of southern Africa and the Western Indian Ocean became better known. The 1977 edition at the 1,700 species, 1983, 2,200, and recently, just last year, the latest version of that book is now in 5 volumes, and it describes 3,500 species, and these are only the coastal footage, not the deep water footage. So that tradition has continued in the Ichthyology Institute. All this time, JLB and Margaret failed to find a coelacanth. Then they decided to mount a campaign where they would offer a reward for a coelacanth. And reward posters were put up all over East Africa. And one was put on this notice board in Zanzibar. And the fellow on the right, Eric Hunt, was a very well-educated Englishman who had decided to seek adventure in the Western Indian Ocean. He bought a trading schooner and he was trading between Dar es Salaam, the Comores and Madagascar. He met J.L.B. Smith, they discussed the reward poster, and Eric Hunt said to Smith, "I will find you a fish." Smith and J.L.B. and Margaret Smith at that time returning from a collecting expedition. In those days you could use the Union Castle liners when you were going from one major fort to another. And I travelled the Dunnet Castle in December 1952 to Durban, having seen the account in Zanzibar. When they got to Durban, to Smith's amazement, there's a telegram from Eric Hunt saying, "I have found the coelacanth for you." And this was quite a sensational thing. Of course, it happened just before Christmas, 3 days before Christmas. And Smith had the dilemma of how on earth does he get to the Comores? There are no regular airlines, there are no shipping lines. Yet this fish was of iconic importance. He phoned all the politicians he knew, some of them were listed there, and finally phoned the Prime Minister, 10:30 at night, while he was on his Christmas holiday. And J.L.B. Smith managed to persuade the Prime Minister that this fish was of such importance that a military aeroplane needed to be made available to fetch it. A journalist later described it as a Prime Minister providing a mad scientist with a military aeroplane to fetch a dead fish from the foreign coast. And that's what it was. It's one of the most remarkable episodes in South African aviation history that this military aircraft was made available. And what's even more amazing is that when they left Durban, they didn't even know whether there was an airstrip in the Comores that was big enough for this approach to land. That's how many chances they took on this trip. Anyway, this is the Dakota 6832, nicknamed the Flying Fish Cart, which was made available to J.L.B. Smith with the full crew. And they flew from Durban to Lorenzo Mark, 3 fuel, and then up into northern Mozambique, overnighted there, across the Mozambique Channel towards the Comores. Now, the fish had been caught on Anduan. It's there you can see it's caught and then transported to Mayotte Island because there was a small airstrip there that the South African forces had built at the end of the Second World War. Now, just for interest, when they got to the vicinity of the strip, J.L.B. asked the pilot, "Is the strip big enough, long enough for us to land?" And the pilot said no. And J.L.B. asked, "Well, what are we going to do?" And he said, "We're going to land anyway." So they landed. Fortunately, there was a hill at the end of the runway, which allowed them to stop in time and also allowed them to take off afterwards. And this is the historic photograph taken on Anduan Island of J.L.B. Smith with the second coelacanth caught in December 1953. And to his, to our left,
Please, he looks.
Eric Hunt, and you can see in his white tunic there the French consul in the Comores who got into serious trouble afterwards for allowing this fish jacking to take place, this extremely valuable fish to be snatched from under his nose. Anyway, they, having taken this photograph, they quickly wrapped the coelacanth up, bundled it into their Dakota and took off. And shortly after they took off, the crew played a trick on Valerie Smith. They pretended to receive an urgent radio message and whispered to one another, and then they said, Professor Smith, I'm afraid we've just learned that French fighter aircraft have been scrambled from Madagascar, and they're going to intercept us and force us to go back. And Joe Smith said, I am not going back. They can shoot us down if they like, but we will continue. And then they all burst into laughter. Anyway, when they got back to Durban, the news had already reached the media. And on the airstrip in Durban, Joe gave a famous speech about the recovery of the second coelacanth. And this speech is regarded as one of the most dramatic in the history of South African science. And I still meet people who heard it or whose parents heard it and have described the emotion around it. And I'll play an extract from the speech for you. Remember, this is in December 1952 by Professor Joe Smith.
Eventually we got away, and there on the deck, swathed in cotton wool, was the fish. I could not bring myself to touch it, and I asked them to open it, and they did. And I knelt down to look, and I'm not ashamed to say that after all that long strain, I wept. For it was true. It was a coelacanth, and what was more wonderful, a species different from that of 1938, another coelacanth. It was more than worth all that long strain. Eric Hunt told me the story. A line fisherman, Ahmad Hussein, at the village of Diomoni on the island of Anjouan, was fishing in 20 meters of water about 200 yards from shore and caught a large fish on the evening of the 20th of December 1952.
All right, we'll leave it there. Anyway, they arrived back in Durban. They then went through to Grahamstown with completely contrary to military regulations. Joe Smith picked up his wife and son, and they flew on to Esterpol Air Force Base in Cape Town. Joe then showed the fish to the Prime Minister in thanks for providing the military aircraft, and not only D.F. Molan's response was, "It's so ugly, are we really descended from this?" and Joe Smith's response was, "I've known uglier people." As Joe said in that interview, he thought originally it was a different species, which he provisionally named Onamia, but in fact subsequent research showed it was the same. Joe published a famous book called Old Foreheads, this is the original copy of which here for you to see, describing the capture of the first and second coelacanths. That book was published in 10 different foreign languages, and in the case of 7 of those languages, it was the first South African book of non-fiction that was in those languages. Over 80,000 copies of this book were sold, and as Roger said, it was second only to Robert's Brother. And when this book went completely out of print, I got permission to publish an annotated Old Foreheads, which includes the original book and new chapters to bring it up to date. And there you can see some of the foreign language editions of Old Foreheads, and I also have some on display. And there you can see how we reprinted the original text exactly as it is, and I added notes in the market. Certainly, Joe Smith took his own life in January 1968 and poisoned himself with one of the poisons that he had lectured about. His eyesight was failing, he felt his mental capacity was failing, and he didn't want to be a burden on his wife. Margaret then set about creating an institute in Joe Smith's name, which she successfully did. The Joe Smith Institute of Ichthyology, now called the South African Institute for Aquatic Biodiversity. And she was the first director, and when she retired, I became the second director. So back to the coelacanths. So the first one was caught in South Africa in 1938. The second one in the Comores, as you can see, it does look a bit different. And the third in the Comores, and in fact the next 70 odd known for science were all caught in the Comores. And they were only went to French museums with a French band of scientists from other countries from collecting and studying them. Of course, the next step in coelacanth research was to see a living one. And Jacques Minot, the French scientist, was the first to do that. A specimen was caught and was kept alive in a flooded boat on Anjouan, and he was able to comment on its behavior. When I took over directorship of the Ichthyology Institute, one of the first things I did was to initiate a research program on the coelacanth in the Comores and in East Africa. And now you can see I'm on the left enjoying a coconut juice with a fisherman who had caught several coelacanths and Mike Burton stubs. And we gathered valuable information from these fishermen. We also examined specimens. I talked to the local diver, Jean-Louis Giroux, and I said, I believe you have a coelacanth specimen. And he said, yes, it's under my bed. He talked after us with a dry. The Japanese fishermen on Anjouan were in the habit of recording their captures by making eotoculus and Japanese fish prints. And the way you make them is you actually paint the fish, you then drape a calico over it, rub it, and then pull it off, and an exact replica of the fish comes up, and then they add the data around it. We then had the good fortune to meet up with Professor Dr. Hans Fricker from the Max Planck Institute in Germany. He, as a youth, had read the German edition of Old Forelegs, and he was determined to be the first person to film the live fish in the Comores. He built this submersible geo, which was capable of going to 200 meters, that couldn't find coelacanths in the Comores. And the fishermen told him he wasn't going deep enough. They told him they lived from 400 to 800 meters, judging from the length of lines if they have to use, if they catch them. So Hans bought a bigger submersible, the Iago, interestingly named after the villain in Othello. And in this two-man submersible, sensational research over a period of 26 years was done on the coelacanth. Literally thousands of photographs and videos taken of the living fish. Initially, Hans dived during the day and they couldn't find any fish. They spoke to the traditional fishermen again, they laughed at them and said, you mustn't drive in the day, you must dive at night. That's when the coelacanth is active. So they dived at night and then within a few hours started finding the coelacanth. And on the right there is the oil fish on top. That's the fish that the traditional fishermen are actually targeting, and mesa is the bait they use. And they actually catch coelacanths by accident. They don't deliberately capture them because they're not edible, and they, at that time, actually had no commercial value. There I am in the Jaeger submersible at the depth of 198 meters. Jaeger can go as deep as 400 meters. And this was a wonderful experience. It was more like traveling back in time than traveling into a space, because you're literally looking out on the world 400 million years ago without any human interference. And that's the sort of thing you see. The arrow shows the tail of a coelacanth. They hide in caves during the day and they hunt at night. They're predators, and there's a classic Fricker photograph. It's a beautiful fish. It's iridescent blue with white spots, and every fish's pattern of white spots is unique, so it's like a fingerprint. So we were able to identify individual fish and track them over more than 2 decades. And there you can quite clearly see the extra lobe on the tail fin. Surprisingly, for large predators, coelacanths are quite social animals. They live in groups during the day in caves, and we found up to 15 in a cave. And then after our studies in the Comores, to our amazement, coelacanth specimens started to become made available to scientists in several other African countries. So in 1991, one was caught in Mozambique, and Hans and I went to examine it. Sadly, it was a pregnant female. It was 24 in year, but we were on a more young inside, but that nevertheless provided very valuable data. And Mozambique didn't hesitate to celebrate this event by issuing a coin and also a stamp. In fact, 26 countries around the world have issued coelacanth stamps, even though coelacanths don't occur in 19 of those countries. Then Tanzania, in 2003, they caught their first coelacanth. Now, several dozen have been caught there, and sadly, this was also a pregnant female. And then, to everyone's surprise, another species of living coelacanth was caught on the other side of the Indian Ocean in Indonesia in 1997, also just before Christmas, by this young American couple. And then another big surprise, in 2000, Peter Tim and his buddy divers discovered a colony of living coelacanths in the Isimangaliso Wetland Park, which is called St. Lucia, Cebuana, and Lake Sabaya in northern Zimbabwe. And that's the population that we were studying intensively now. So there's the Mail and Guardian heading of that capture. This is Jessa Point at Sondwana Bay, and off Jessa Point there are deep canyons where coelacanths live. You can see it, that's an image of the canyons there. And if you're a properly qualified mixed gas diver, you can actually go and dive with living coelacanths. More recently, this remote-operated unmanned submersible was bought by the Oceanography Institute in Grahamstown, the CI, and that is now doing a lot of the underwater work. One of the photographers who's visited the Isimangaliso colony is Lorenzo Lester. It's a world-famous Italian photographer, and there you can see one of his crew. We're very fortunate in that the coelacanth is a very relaxed and laid-back animal. It doesn't panic and swim away fast like other big predators. In fact, it's so placid that from the jaguar, using a mechanical arm, we were able to take scales off it and plant tags in it. So it's a wonderful early cooperative fish to study. Coelacanths were also found around Madagascar, and I've recently published a paper with a colleague in Madagascar where at least 36 specimens have been caught there. But nowadays, the emphasis is not on catching them or even encouraging traditional fishermen to catch them, but rather to study the living animal. Then another sensation, just before COVID, some amateur mixed gas divers diving in the Mvumbi Canyon on the south coast of KwaZulu-Natal, to their utter surprise, came across a living coelacanth. And using a CI submersible, we subsequently found that there's a colony there of at least 7, probably more, individuals. So that means they live in Zululand, they live off the south coast, that one was caught off East London. So those are the dates of discovery. First one in East London in 38, then the Comores 52, the first live sighting in the Comores in 87, and then steadily others caught in other East African countries. And that's a map showing where they've been caught. Yellow circle is Latimeria alumni, and the red circle over in Indonesia is the Indonesian species. Now, a little bit about coelacanth anatomy and breeding. The coelacanth doesn't follow the rules that humans have laid down. It's neither a bony fish or a coelacanth. It has characteristics of both. So it has a bony head, it has bony supports for the fins, but it's got a flexible, hollow notochord like a shark. It's got other features of sharks, such as a particular valve in the intestine, which only sharks and rays have. It's even got some characteristics of four-legged animals on land, like frogs, in terms of internal structure of its head. So it has been put in a completely different taxonomic group. It's neither a bony fish nor coelacanth fish, and in some classifications it's actually more closely related to frogs than to fishes. There's a clear specimen where the colouring has been taken out of the flesh, and you can clearly see that sort of hollow tube backbone, so they don't have bony articulating vertebrae at all. Now, what The coelacanth continues to surprise us. Initially, J.L.B. Smith predicted that they would produce a mermaid's perch with the egg inside and release that. And it was the only thing that he was wrong about. In fact, the coelacanths produce huge eggs, the largest egg of any fish, the size of a grapefruit, and a very small number of eggs, and they hatch inside the mother. The amazing thing is the pregnancy period, the incubation period from fertilization to birth is an astonishing 60 months, 5 years. Sure. That's more than twice as long as the next longest gestation period, that of the African elephant. And when you consider that most fishes' pregnancy is a few weeks or a few months, it's quite extraordinary that it's 5 months. And the young, when they're born, when they're big, they weigh half a kilogram and they weigh 33 centimeters long. So, and the female's carrying between 20 and 60 of those young. So quite a load to carry for 5 years. The other amazing thing is that the fossil pre-born juvenile coelacanth was found, and there's a clear impression of where the yolk sac was. So this method of the eggs hatching inside the mother and the young growing up initially from the yolk and the yolk sac has been going on for over 240 million years in coelacanths. That's long before mammals developed childbearing. This is the only photograph we have so far of a newly born coelacanth. You can see the fins are disproportionately large, and this is of the Indonesian species. And we don't know exactly where the juveniles live, but we suspect they live deep in small caves in shallow water. Now, one thing we don't know is whether the coelacanths guard their young. I've done a lot of research on this in fishes, and I predict that they do, that they protect their young for the first 2 weeks of the day, but we don't know. And here are just some of the unique features of the coelacanth. It has the slowest metabolic rate of any backboned animal. They reach at least 100 years in age for females, and are 2 meters in length and 100 kilograms in weight. They have their unique factive dots. They show very unusual social behavior. They're active at night. They have extremely well-developed electroreception, like crop. In fact, the sight is very poor, and they detect their prey using electrical reception. They're ambush hunters. They have this advanced breeding style in very long hunting. So what is their significance? Firstly, their enormous longevity, 420 million years. They're the ultimate survivors, and I think we can learn a few lessons from them. Their anatomy is very conservative, so they look now, in terms of the external anatomy, very much like they lived a few hundred million years ago, but internally they're very advanced. And they have this complex relationship with sharks and lungfishes and four-legged animals. They are close to the transition in backbone animals from water to land, which is one of the biggest steps in evolution. But in fact, recent research has shown that the lungfish are even closer, and the lungfishes are their closest living relatives. And it's that they're known as a living fossil and a window into the past. Something that interests me is not only their natural history, but their cultural history. As I said, many countries have issued coelacanth stamps, and this is a unique pair of memorial stamps signed by J.L.B. Smith. And in 1989, South Africa issued 4 stamps to commemorate the coelacanth. Only the second set of stamps issued by South Africa to commemorate the scientific discovery. The first 16 cents shows the fish, 30 cents show J.L.B. and Marjorie, 40 shows Ichthyol Bean Street, and 50 shows a living coelacanth with a Jago in the background. Coelacanths have also been a great inspiration to artists. There is 2 examples there, and they've appeared on the money of at least 12 countries worldwide. These are some of the artworks I have. On the right is a stainless steel sculpture of the coelacanth, and if you look carefully, there's a man inside, and that's made by the Cape Town artist Uber Pfaff. There's a table lamp, and this is a coelacanth made out of used tea bags. And this is a very recent sculpture by the Cape Town-based sculptor Van Steen in the Monkey Mickey and the Starfish series. It shows this little girl with a baby coelacanth. Of course, there were masks, survival masks during COVID, and even in outer Mongolia, there's a wind running in the form of coelacanth. So its cultural history is very rich. Hollywood movie has been made of it. It's an inspiration for artists, for appears in poems and songs, and has become a symbol of survival. During our research, we became very concerned that the coelacanth was overfished, and after surviving all these hundreds of millions of years, we may cause it extinct. So together with this Karen Hissman and Jürgen Schauer and Hans Fricke and others, we mounted this campaign, and our slogan was, "Let them be where they are." Because at that time, the Japanese were actively trying to catch living coelacanths to put in the Theater Aquarium. And they were deploying traps like this, and one night after they deployed the trap, Hans Fricke went down in his submersible and he actually put a message in the trap. And then they happened to go and visit the Japanese ship the next day when they hauled up the trap and they found this message inside. And they turned tail and went back to Japan. Subsequently, we've had great success with coelacanth conservation in that the local authorities have declared it to be a sacred fish that may not be caught, and if it is caught, it's got to be immediately released. So they are no longer threatened in the Comores, but sadly that's not the case in Tanzania, where they are being absolutely massacred using nets set for sharks.
What are they doing with them, say?
They sell them, they're trying to sell them to museums now. So this wonderful coelacanth centre was established in Zulu in Comore. From subscription from people around the world, and there's a display of the caves that coelacanths live in of Guanacamole. And this is a mural that was recently painted in Moroni, celebrating the coelacanth. Now, I worked for the Oceans Aquarium during its formative stages, and one of the questions was, should we have a coelacanth in captivity? Knowing that there are certain things about their biology that we would never be able to study in the wild. And of course, it would be an enormous attraction and generate a lot of income. Is it possible? Well, it would be very easy to have coelacanths. Is it ethical? After a long debate, the international aquarium and research community has decided, no, it's not ethical. They are too rare. They're too precious, they have so much still to tell us that ethically we cannot justify having them in captivity. So the why and the wherefore away, any large aquarium would in fact be able to keep the coelacanths alive in life. But the alternative we're going for is that I'm working with some 3D printer engineers, and we're creating a robotic coelacanth that will be able to swim around in a public aquarium, and at least used as an educational tool. Now, none of these are our special. These are various other attempts at robotic coelacanth, none of them very good. And just for interest, this is a 3D printed coelacanth here, and with those people, we'll be creating a 1 meter long model to swim around. Lego Maker has the use of robotic coelacanth that looks like that, but it just sort of moves on land, waggles its fin. It can't swim in water. And this is an animation to show how the coelacanth swims. It actually holds its tail fin stiff and its first dorsal fin stiff, and it paddles with its pectorals and tail legs. So we think that's going to be quite easy to model on a coelacanth. And finally, to say I've published a number of books that are all on sale here, and I will be donating part of the proceeds from the sale of those books to the Museum of Historical Society. I leave 2 other books of mine. Thank you very much.
Sorry, one question. How long do coelacanths live for?
The maximum age we found is about 100 years. So they're very long lived. The only fishes that live longer than that are various sharks in the polar regions and various other polar fishes. So there's a much longer lived than most fishes. It's been very difficult to aid them because their scales don't have regular rings, so kind of lenses, and nor do their bones, so we've had to use a whole combination of methods.
Can they swim vertically, upside down or backwards?
Yeah, in the sea it really doesn't matter which way up you are. In caves we find them hovering upside down, head down, tail down. And in fact, one of the ways they hunt is at night, because they're not using sight, they move along in a vertical stand along the bottom using the current, detecting the electrical field of fishes in the sand. And when they detect the prey, then they ambush it and suck it in. So they're not using sight finding at all. They're effectively blind at night. So yeah, they do, like many fish that adopt all sorts of postures.